Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowdon Delicatessen. I'm Aaron Rand from CJD, along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette, Lesley Chesterman, and our special guest today, Jack Jedwab, President, CEO, founder, establisher, pick the title, of the Association for Canadian Studies and the Metropolis Institute. So Jack, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Aaron.
Maybe before anything else, you could explain what the Association for Canadian Studies does, and specifically what Metropolis Montreal does, because I don't think a lot of people are familiar with that.
Right. So the Association for Canadian Studies promotes knowledge about Canada, notably through research and publications and conferences as well, across the country. In fact, we also have a mandate to promote knowledge about Canada abroad. We do that through bilateral arrangements with different countries. In 2012, we inherited or took over a project called Metropolis Canada. That was a government-run conference on immigration integration. It was the largest conference in the country on immigration integration. We've expanded Metropolis Canada. It's become Metropolis Institute and continues to do these very large conferences, a number over the course of the year, on immigration integration. It also involves other conferences that happen outside of Canada. So we run Metropolis Americas, something called Metropolis Francophonie Mondiale, which is a group of French-speaking experts on immigration that convene annually to look at the challenges associated with immigrant settlement. And we have several other research projects, all again under the auspices of Metropolis Institute.
So you study demographics in this country, you study you search out public opinion, and I know Bill had said to me when we were going to do this, to say, you know what, this most recent one, which concerns how Canadians and how Quebecers feel about their country, pride, opinion like that. From what I gathered here, and I read Alison Haynes' column on this in the Gazette, which quoted a lot of what you had done, you were surprised. You're typically not that surprised by information that you find, but you were surprised by this, specifically with respect to how Quebecers feel about Quebec and about Canada. Can you share some of that?
Well, the poll's a wide-ranging poll. What I focused on that was different from previous polls that we've undertaken in the past, because we've done a lot of work on attachment to Canada on the part of Quebecers and other Canadians. We've tracked the evolution of attachment to Canada for about 20 years now to see how things have shifted. But in this particular case, as regards this survey, I tried something a bit different. I asked Canadians whether they identified as a majority, a minority, or both a majority and a minority. I did this in a way that was unprompted. So I didn't say, are you majority in Canada? Are you a majority in North America, in Montreal, etc.? Just try to get a better idea, if I don't give you any geographic context, of how you spontaneously define yourself. Right? Because we hear a lot about the majority in Quebec and the minority being usually associated with the English-speaking community, or others that are not part of the French-speaking community, which describes itself as a majority in Quebec, but a minority in a sea of English speakers in North America. So there's sort of that combination. And that identification shapes the way in which governments justify policies very often in Quebec. Say, look, as a majority, we expect you, the minority, to respect our democratic will, if you'd like. As a minority, we need you to understand the situation we're in within North America. So you see that sort of interaction, if you like, between the two. So what surprised me here was when I didn't put any of those prompts in, the only group in Canada that described itself as majority were Francophones in Quebec. So
contrary to the spin that we get often from our government.
Right, because if you're being told repeatedly over a number of years you're part of the majority and that's being hammered away at you, you will instantly or spontaneously react in that particular way.
Right.
Now, presumably, if you're a minority, right, which you're very often described that way by some thought leaders in Quebec, we're a minority, a small minority in North America, there is a majority, which is the English-speaking group. And yet the English-speaking group in the rest of Canada did not define itself as a majority. Right? Now, in part that's because they don't see their identity, at least from my analysis, through the prism of language. Right? They'll see their identity through the prism of a variety of other things, whether it's their ethnic origins, whether it's their racial or racialized backgrounds, whether it's their gender, whether it's... So a variety of other things are being factored in when you ask the question unprompted as to whether you describe yourself as a majority or minority. And in Canada, you very often hear this in the U.S., it's described as a nation of minorities, right? Because the demographics are so diverse that the way we define ourselves in that sort of, in multiple iterations or in parts, lends itself to thinking I'm part of minority. At least some part of my personality sort of lends itself to the idea that I'm part of minority.
So essentially, francophones feel like are actually most secure in the fact that they feel like a majority in their own.
Because they're instinctively reacting to the fact they're in Quebec. They're I think a lot of their reactions are the basis of which language community they belong to, as opposed to any other marker of their identity. Because language is the way in which they principally define themselves,
Right.
Which isn't the case for the rest of the country. That's not to say that language is unimportant to people's identities
Right.
outside of Canada. In fact, it may be that we take language for granted as an aspect of our identity. We don't think of our language identity when people ask us, where are you from, or what's most important to you? You know, you will not necessarily respond that way.
Unless, of course, you're in Quebec, in which case you say language is that issue that comes up on top. Very much different from the rest of the country.
Absolutely,
Right.
because we also asked questions in the same survey about the extent to which people said they were more or less attached to various aspects of their identity, whether it was language, ethnicity, religion, country, in this case Canada, province, Quebec, and what came up more disproportionately more often in Quebec when I did this in a ranking as opposed to a weighing system. Because I asked the question two ways. One was sort of weigh your attachments. If I ask you to sort of weigh your attachments, say, are you attached to your language? Yes. You're attached to your religion? Yes. You're attached to your ethnicity? Yes. You know, so I'm attached to everything. But if I ask you to rank them, what's most important to you, you're going to get something very different. And in the ranking, Quebecers disproportionately rank language higher than anyone else did in the rest of the country, where people rank Canada as most important to their identity in that ranking. They put their nation or country first before the other markers of identity on that list. Actually, the rest of Canada put language at the bottom on the ranking. Right? So they put language as high on terms of attachment. Yes, my language is important to me. I feel attached to it. But if you're asking me to make choices as regards what most defines me, in the rest of Canada, they put language on the bottom of that list.
Right.
Right. So,
You could argue, though, that Quebecers put language and culture side by side. So it is their identity, is their language.
Correct.
Whereas you're right, for so many other Canadians, if you're, let's say you're Asian and you speak English, the last thing you're going to do is say, oh, I'm English. You know, you're going to go by saying I'm Asian, right? So it's logical.
Yeah, I think so too. It's just a question of us understanding each other, or contributing to how we better understand each other's sense of what's important to us from an identity standpoint, so that we, you know, when we sort of see the other, you know, how we determine the sort of interaction we'll have with that other is very often shaped by how we define ourselves. So
I'm wondering, are you able to extrapolate from this any threats, like within, whether or not, like Anglos, Francos, or whatever feel their culture, their language is threatened? Are you able to pick up from your survey anything on that level?
Not in this particular survey, but I've done enough other surveys that sort of lend themselves to better understanding where those threats emerge. So consistently, for example, if you ask in Quebec whether you feel your language is threatened, Francophones will say, at least sort of 75% will say yes, they feel the French language is threatened. If I ask that unprompted, that's usually their response. If I ask them, even if I ask them in Quebec, they'll say, it's a similar percentage, that their language is threatened. In fact, what I found paradoxical is that more Francophones in Quebec will say, I feel that my language or the French language is threatened, than will Francophones outside of Quebec when I ask them about the threat to the French language, even though you look at the numbers, they're much more threatened. So it's just how you sort of estimate that threat, where you sort of put the bar with respect to that threat.
You also found, I want to make sure I have this right, in this study with respect to Montreal, and this is the part that's really interesting to me as well. You know, you hear from the government now, from the Premier, about how Montreal poses a threat specifically, right? Because too many English people, too much English spoken here. Yet in this study, I think you found Francophones don't share that opinion.
Well, what they're saying is simply that if I ask them if they feel, again, unprompted and spontaneously as a majority or a minority in Montreal itself, the majority will say we feel as though we're a majority in Montreal, right? Some will say a majority, minority, both. Only about 11 or 12% say they feel like a minority. Now, again, you know, thought leaders and the government sort of will instrumentalize, is a big word here, or exploit these feelings and try to situate the context as regards how Francophones should see themselves, or how they should feel insecure or more secure, based on, you know, whether in Montreal, their demographic situation suggests they're headed towards this minority position. Right now, again, you've got to sort of unpack this, right? If demographers in Quebec, with whom I've had many arguments over many years, who like to say, well, the island of Montreal will soon be an English island because the Francophones will constitute 49.5% of the population on the basis of their first language being French, not the extent to which people speak French, not the extent to which they speak French at home, not, looking for the lowest common denominator in terms of how you can bring that percentage down within the island, right? So that presumes, again, there's a majority. Now, what's interesting, they'll say the majority, they don't all say the majority is English. They won't be the majority. So who's the majority? Right? The majority is that combination of English speakers that are a minority, right, at 20% or whatever it is, and the allophones at, say, 30% who are not a group. There are a multitude of languages that you have to sort of, again, reposition this thing in order to highlight that threat by saying it's the others, that one big group. I don't know about you, Aaron. I like to sort of say this sometimes. No one's ever invited me to a meeting of non-Francophones. I've never been invited. We're having a meeting of non-Francophones, folks. We're all going to get together and figure out what language is going to be the dominant language. Is it going to be, French, English, or one of the other 200 languages that collectively bring us together as non-Francophones? We don't exist that way as a majority. So clearly the majority are Francophones. So the government and thought leaders for political purposes will try to exploit these insecurities that justify language legislation very often. But in fact, if you look at what's happening on the ground, that's not the way Monsieur, Madame, tout le monde, qui est francophone, who's a francophone, feels about their status.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowdon Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the home of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowdon Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowdon Delicatessen. We hear over, and we continue to hear over and over again, the idea that French is threatened. The French is, you've heard this, I mean, especially lately from the Premier himself, before they introduced new legislation in Bill 96. Do you get a sense, because this has been sort of one of those points where depending on who you ask, and you're pointing out on the Francophone side, maybe it's different, that French is in fact in decline and threatened. When you ask people if they feel that way, what's the answer that you get?
Well, again, from Francophones, if I ask them that question flat out, they'll say that they think French is threatened, right? So now, a lot of that has to do with the positioning of discourse that tells them that in North America, we are a small minority relative to a large English-speaking sea. So I think that's the way in which people sort of unpack this and respond accordingly
but I want to see,
by virtue of that. So
that's the part I don't get.
Sort of ambiguity. I
it's
am
always
part of the majority.
Yeah, it's
but,
always been this way, though.
Yeah.
We've always been
will.
a small part in a giant North America. It's only now
Yeah.
that, call them what you want, our thought leaders are actually pointing this out and trying to make people believe that it's much worse now than it's ever been before.
No, I think actually, to be fair, I think they've consistently been doing that, and they do it sometimes when they want to justify particular action, and other times they won't do that. But I think what's interesting right now is that the government, which is highlighting that threat and therefore trying to introduce more stringent language measures, isn't able to say they've made any progress. Right? So it's nice to say the French language threat. We've been telling you this for 10 years, and since we've been in power, and the previous government told you this, and the one before as well. But what have you done to improve the situation? Now, presumably, if something's threatened, you're going to try to improve the situation, right? That's what the electors want.
So this is why they come down heavy on our universities all of a sudden as a way to prove it. Do you think that's going to have any impact whatsoever in terms of...
It will on the universities, clearly.
Yes, but not from the...
But it will not, clearly in terms of the demographics, it will not change the position of the French language in the way in which that's been presented, which is not a function of how many people speak French. It's a function of the percentage of people in a particular area that are first language Francophones, right? So that's the way this keeps getting unpacked. So you can make that threat appear more or less, if you like, important or potent as you wish.
But what's it achieved?
Well,
you're saying what's it achieved, and the answer is not very much.
No, not because, and I think that right now, to some extent, it's contributing to the government being hung out to proverbial dry, because you can't keep saying there's a threat, and not show that you're doing anything that will improve the situation based on the way you define that
Right.
situation.
But there is the $800 million that they want to spend on improving the French language and having more French classes for immigrants. Are you saying that's money down the toilet?
No, I'm saying that I actually think that those are good investments to the extent that they're going to help people to learn the French language, and particularly targeting newcomers. I believe it's important to learn the French language. I think we all should speak the French language, not as a first language necessarily, but we should all be able to speak that, and thankfully this generation or coming generations, Z and millennials increasingly are able to do that, which is a very good thing. So I think that money is well spent money. I actually think that a lot of the solution to this is in recruiting and attracting more French-speaking immigrants. I'm favorable to that. I think that's a positive thing. Now, to be fair, those French-speaking immigrants who come here probably, if they're not already bilingual, will end up being bilingual. That's a reality that the government doesn't acknowledge, right? Because it's sort of, bilingualism is something that there's a lot of ambiguity about, and sometimes it's the B word. It's not a word we want to use because the spread of bilingualism is a danger. But the reality is, in the government's own recruitment efforts, if you recruit immigrants from, say, Morocco, right? A lot of those people coming from Morocco are able to speak both French and English. So when the government shares its data with you, if you look at it closely, it's going to show growing rates of bilingualism amongst the population, because the immigrants themselves, even if their French is their first language, the reality is in the universe right now, English is very often the second language of a lot of the newcomers here. Having said that, as I said earlier, that's money well invested. It is important for people to learn the French language. We are encountering increases in our number of immigrants. We do need immigration. The Premier can say on the one hand, as he did, I guess, not the last election, but the previous one, I'm reducing immigration to make you feel secure about the French language. I've reduced it by 5,000 or 10,000 in terms of our permanent residents. From 50,000, he went down to 40,000. Right? But then industry said, we need immigrants. So nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Don't worry about it, industry. I'm going to raise the number of temporary workers massively, which he did massively, more than any other part of Canada. Now he's saying, oh, that's not good, there's too many of them. But you're the one who told industry that you were going to address that issue with the temporary stream while reducing the permanent numbers to speak to your core constituency and give them the impression that you were going to do something that would help the position of the French language. Right? So it hasn't worked in the end, based on the same government saying, and it's sort of the ministers and others saying, the French language is in decline. Well, what are you doing about it? Well, all these measures will not contribute to changing the demographics, right, which is how they're defining the problem, right? Because increasingly people are able to speak French.
For immigrants in countries like Austria, you have to be eligible, you have to have a German level 3. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because we say, oh, it's so ridiculous to have all these people. But in other countries, immigrants are required to learn the language before coming to a certain level.
Yeah.
So it's really not wrong to tell people to...
No, and it's fine. And look, in the rest of Canada also, we've put more emphasis on language knowledge. We've tried to target countries where people are able to speak one of the two official languages as much as possible. And to the extent we're unable to do that because we need immigration, then we are trying to make sure there are programs in place here in order to get them up to speed in terms of language knowledge, because if you're going to function effectively in the workplace, you will need to know one of the official languages depending on where you are. And personally in Montreal, I think if you're going to enhance your chances for opportunity and mobility, you'll need to know both.
Yeah.
Whether the government acknowledges that, and thought leaders wish to acknowledge that, you need to know both. Oh my gosh, don't say that, because then we're encouraging English, and soon these people say bonjour, hi. Oh, how horrible. I mean, sorry to belabor this thing, the last point, but I have colleagues in the government, I won't name them, who, on the bonjour, hi issue, right, they thought, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna switch to bonjour, hello. Right? You might have seen this. Like you go to the airport, it's bonjour, hello, right? Because don't say bonjour, hi, you'll offend those people in the Quebec. I mean, I think, and I've told my colleagues, this is silly. This is not an answer. It's silly. And this whole this issue of adopting a resolution in the National Assembly, I mean, this is going to have zero impact on the French language. Only Matthew Bocoté and people who follow him think this is going to have any meaningful impact. on the position of the French language. Clearly, it's not, actually. And actually, more people say bonjour, hi than ever since they've drawn attention to it.
You know, you described a situation, Jack, where if you stop and think about it for a second, so you brought up immigration, right, and how things have changed basically over the last 4 or 5 years. First with the Premier saying one thing, now, of course, we find out something else. Have you done a survey on Canadians? Because immigration has now or is now becoming an issue. And it may raise itself during, the political campaign.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Have you done one of these?
We're doing them constantly, both in Canada and outside of Canada.
And have you found things changing in respect to how
there's
people
been a
feel?
tremendous change in the space of 12 to 18 months from February of 2023, if you like, to the end of the year. Right? Usually when you ask, the standard question polling companies ask is, do you feel there are too many immigrants, about the right number, or too few immigrants? That's sort of the tracking question that is generally asked here and in many other countries. And it went from sort of 30% saying there were too many to close to 50%. And even though government, the federal government has its own tracking polling through Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada, they're showing the increase at about 10 points, right? There's a methodological issue. But most of the other polling companies, Environics, Angus Reid, Leger, with whom we work, we're all at close to 50% saying there are too many immigrants, and that's been, as I said, that shift occurred in a very short period of time coming out of the pandemic, which was interesting. Actually.
On that note, Jack, I just heard a survey come out today, I think. Worldwide, what country would people go to given the state of politics everywhere in Europe and Middle East and everywhere? And you're thinking, well, maybe England, France, Germany. Guess number one country and where people are thinking of immigrating to. You know what it is?
I would think, personally, I think it's the United States or Canada.
Canada.
Yeah.
These are American, they want to come here. Everybody wants to come
Which,
here.
based on the number of immigrants we've been taking in, kind of makes sense, right? It's been a bit of an open door.
But does that come as a surprise?
No,
from
I mean,
around
there's
the
been
world.
polling around this issue before, and the people generally do pick the United States first, and then they pick Canada. It's shifted a bit back and forth, to be fair.
But now-
those are the two countries that tend to be the ones they select most often. And again, there's this perception about openness or hostility to immigration. Right now, immigration is a very hot issue on the electoral platforms of many countries. It will be a big issue in the United States. It is, and it will be in this next election. In fact, Donald Trump is certainly going to be hammering away at this issue, right, as he already began to do in the first debate. And in Canada, this risks being an issue on our election agenda. It was an issue, to be fair, that backfired on Stephen Harper and the Conservatives. You may remember this, on the Syrian refugee question. Right. And on Chris Alexander as well, who was then the immigration minister under the Harper administration. So Canadians didn't seem to feel comfortable about the discourse around Syrian refugees and some of these sort of borderline pejorative issue on certain groups of peoples, right? So, we'll see. It's a major issue in France. It's as we're seeing the tide shift in France quite significantly. We'll know more in the coming days about where that's all headed politically. It's a major issue across Europe. And even in Canada, in terms of what Aaron asked earlier, relative to the increase in the percentage of Canadians who now are saying there are too many immigrants, I've tried to probe this issue much further. I've asked, why do you think there are too many immigrants? And the answers I get are more economically oriented than culturally oriented. So it's not as much about where the immigrants are from or their background. It's more about housing issues. We're hearing constantly that there's a massive housing crisis. There is a housing crisis, and this issue is being tied to immigration. In fact, some thought leaders are tying it to immigration. So the more you hammer away at that message that, there's a housing crisis, we're getting a lot more immigration, do we have housing for them? I was involved in a lot of these, whether it's the Afghan refugee issues or the Ukrainian migrants, and Afghan refugees were long stayers in hotels, as we know, and I believe there's still some in hotels. So there are some serious issues.
And Trump has completely tied it to crime.
He has done.
That is what he's. That's all you hear.
Which is very dangerous. Yeah. And in France they've tied it to identity issues. Yeah. So it's a real mixed bag right now. But in Canada as well. Again, we're not at where France is, thankfully. And we're not where the United States is. We have a different issue in terms of our borders, to be fair.
Yeah,
in
and
the
our
United
weather.
States. What?
Our weather
There is that.
certainly
Yeah.
helps.
No, they've had a serious issue on their borders, and now Mexico has an issue on their borders as well. So, and so this is, I'd say, one of the bigger challenges of this part of the century. Not to be fair, across our history, immigration has been an issue with all kinds of ramifications and really awful discourse.
To Leslie's point before about people needing a certain level grade, in another language proficiency level, I'm kind of wondering. It seemed to me I remember a statistic not that long ago, Jack, where the government had said if we were going to teach, and this is not necessarily immigrants, but people who want to learn French. So some who are from an older generation who didn't have that opportunity in school because it wasn't very well taught in school, and the government said it would take $1 billion to hire enough teachers to be able to teach French, as if that's kind of a way out of saying, you should have learned this on your own. Where are we on that?
No, there are significant challenges and shortages of teachers and teacher training and so forth, but there are technologies in place now as well in terms of language acquisition that are designed to help people. They're getting better and better. There are opportunities, ideally in advance, for people to learn those languages. Right? It's a challenging situation, but the numbers are not bad in terms of the extent to which people are learning English and or French upon arrival, disproportionately French in Quebec. The numbers are reasonably decent, and we are getting higher percentages of Francophone immigration. So,
I think the bigger issue actually for Quebecers isn't so much language, is people not integrating into the Quebecois society. So when you're talking about language, if people don't want to learn the language, they can end up being in a kind of a ghetto situation that they're living with people instead of integrating into society, which you could even say some Anglos do. But this is a big problem, and that's why in places like Denmark, they insist that all the kids learn Danish in daycare and everything, because they want the future generations to not set themselves aside from Danish society. They want and that is absolutely true, and it's essential in this province.
It does get into a question around how we define integration and what that means. I was watching, this will be a little nostalgic for you, maybe I was watching, back in the day, on Le Point, right? They used to have, after the Téléjournal, they had Le Point. Simon de Rivage, right, who's the then sort of moderator of the show, who's a fine person, a colleague actually, and he was interviewing a group of people of Haitian background in Quebec, right, in Montreal actually, and talking about integration issues, and he asked them if they've ever visited Rimouski. I had to scratch my head. I said, "Est-ce que vous avez déjà visité Rimouski?" And they said no, and I'm like, well, why did he ask that question? Like, I've been to Rimouski. Does that make me integrate? I only was there once, actually. So no, just like so. I hate to use that example.
I didn't go to Rimouski till I was 40.
There you go. So I'm just saying
yeah.
but you've been there, so you're good. But it gets into that issue of beyond French,
right? Do you
beyond the
poutine?
Acquisition of French? Right. What does it mean to be integrated?
Right.
Now they've had these debates we've had this Charter of Values debate. You have to agree with Bill 21 to be integrated? I mean, I hope not. That'd be anti-democratic.
Well, Jean-François Lisée famously had that Actualité cover story with the frog on the cover, and showing that Anglophones really knew nothing about Quebec society because we didn't know Marie-Mé.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm on the cover with him in that one. Right? It's an exchange. So when I forgot the name of the journalist, she came to visit me. Right? I saw the handwritten notes that Jean-François Lisée had put in, because he had that poll. Right? And so. The journalist, I heard, no me merci, I saw that Marie-Mé thing right away, right? And I was like, geez, they're asking whether they know Marie-Mé. I said, hang on a sec. I'm going to phone, because my wife's Francophone, and some of my relatives obviously are Francophone. So I started phoning them in front of her. I said, est-ce que vous connaissez Marie-Mé? I did. I started.
And did they?
4 out of 10.
Right.
So I have to know Marie-Mé, right?
Right.
And so,
did they know Gordon Lightfoot?
I didn't ask.
Okay.
But Marie-Mé, they didn't pass the test. I'm saying these are Francophones. They don't know Marie-Mé. So why are Anglophones not integrated in Marie-Mé? It makes no sense. So
It's
actually, the whole
generational
Marie-Mé thing, when she became sort of more popular amongst Anglophones, I didn't get the credit for that I deserve. Jean-François got all the credit for that thing.
Sorry, Jean.
Yeah, it's okay. We're fixing it right now.
I would have thought the
Starting
question would have
today.
been, do you know Ellie May? I think more people might have known.
Yeah.
Marie-Mé.
Yeah, and
Jack,
Jethro.
That's
of course.
another
For sure,
generational
Jeffrey.
thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We're out of time, Jack. I want to thank you so much for coming
Thank you,
by.
Jack.
Thank you.
Covering a lot of ground here today. That's it for us. We'll see you soon on the next edition of the Corner Booth Podcast. Thanks.